Welcome to Connecting the Dots, a laser focused, quick fire interview on food and the economy with international experts, where we seek answers to questions all of us should be asking. I'm Ajay Jakhar, Chairman Bharat Krishik Samaj of Farmers Forum India. Today, we are delighted to interview Anna Lappe, author of Diet for a Hot Planet and founder of Real Food Media and director of the Food Sovereignty Fund at Pantaria Foundation, a food systems expert and a committed, passionate sustainable food advocate. Thank you, Anna, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
It's the 50th anniversary of the world famous book, Diet for a Small Planet. Why was it a trailblazer then, and why is it even more relevant now in your words?
Yeah, so in 1971, 50 years ago, my mother, Frances Moore Lappe, wrote a book that, as you said, went on to sell millions of copies and really shift the conversation about food systems around the world. And the book in 1971 made what today might seem kind of an everyday argument, which is that the way that industrial meat and dairy production is organized, taking livestock away from their kind of natural process of grazing on the land and integrated with landscapes, and instead moving to an industrial model that requires enormous amounts of livestock feed to raise cattle, to raise livestock, is a really wasteful, it's a polluting, it's a destructive system that we have, of course, seen now expand around the world. And at the time, she raised the question, why? Why are we choosing to move in this direction when, again, we have these models for food production that are very ecologically grounded and very sustainable? And part of the book included, actually, half of the book were recipes to show that you could eat a plant-rich diet and thrive. And at the time, this was a really heretical message. People didn't think in this country that one could survive without putting meat at the center of the plate. So it was radical at the time, and I think it has really continued to captivate audiences over the decades.
And we see the problem has only magnified over the period of time. And
yeah, I would just say, I mean, absolutely. When you look at, in particular, some of the most precious, important regions of the world, so the biodiverse rainforests of Brazil, for instance, something on the order of magnitude of 80% of forest loss in Brazil has been driven by agribusiness interests, much of that from the demand for livestock feed or land for grazing. So yes, the issues have only become more urgent and more pressing today.
And that's why the phrase vote with your dollar has been used to drive attention to conscious consumerism. Talk us through this concept, please, and tell us how and where it has worked, because this is the future. You have to get consumers on to become activists.
Sure. So vote with your dollar is so critical because, every day, many of us around the world are making choices about where we spend our money, and we can try to align those choices with the needs of the planet for more sustainable food supply chains and other supply chains. So, personally, when it was time for me to replace my old broken down stove in my kitchen, I could choose to kind of vote with my dollar for getting gas out of my home and choose an induction stove. And those are just, one example of a kind of consumer choice we make. Food, of course, is a choice we make every day. What food we eat, what food, who we're supporting when we make food choices. But I would kind of argue that in addition to the vote with the dollar message is kind of the corollary that we as individuals making those choices in the marketplace, we are just a whisper in the supply chain. And so how we really mobilize our voices so we go from a whisper to a yell is to connect with social movements, to be part of a conversation bigger than our individual selves. For instance, to be saying it is a human rights crisis that so many farmers and farm workers around the country and the world are poisoned by pesticides. Let's mobilize our voices beyond just choosing organic at the grocery store to make sure that we have regulations on the books to protect farmers and farm workers from pesticides and all of us from the exposure to pesticides, for instance. And the final note I'll make about the vote with your dollar message, which I think is important, is that our individual choices should always be seen as kind of the beginning, not the end of how we are engaging with trying to change systems. And the other final note I'd say is that unfortunately, for so many of us, we don't have real choice in the marketplace to really express ourselves with our vote, with those dollars. And so that's where we always want to marry the conversation about consumer action and consumer choice with the conversation about how to change the food environments or the other kind of marketplace environments that we, oops, shit.
Yes,
Oop,
we can
I
hear
just
you.
lost you.
No, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry, completely lost you for a second. So we always want to be marrying the conversation about consumer choice with, how do we actually change the marketplace?
Which gets us to the question of how do you describe the links between industry, media, and public institutions as major obstacles in pursuit of sustainable food systems? We as a farmers organization have constantly talked about consolidation in the food value chain, creating big problems. So what are the most striking examples of the stealth PR tactics these corporate houses use, and what could we do about it? How would you describe them?
So it's a great question. And along with my writing and advocacy about food systems and sustainability has been my long fascination and interest in the storytelling piece of the puzzle. Why do we believe what we believe? Where have we gotten our information from? And as part of that curiosity, I have dug into the public relations machine of the food industry. So looking at the ways in which companies shape our understanding of food beyond just the obvious. They market to us. I think Coca-Cola spent something like $5 billion last year to market their products to us. That's obvious. We see the ads. But what is more concerning to me and really insidious are these stealth tactics that companies use to shape our understanding of food systems. And I'll give you, I think, a really powerful example of this. But is the funding of what are called astroturf organizations. So they're organizations that to you and me might seem like farmers organizations or consumer organizations, but they are fully developed and funded by a public relations effort and by a company. So a recent example out of the EU was an organization called Freedom to Farm. I don't know if you ever heard of it, but it emerged around 2015, when the EU was debating whether they would reauthorize across the EU the use of the weed killer known as Roundup, or glyphosate is the active ingredient, glyphosate-based herbicide. So governments were debating, should we reauthorize this? What are the health concerns? One of the world's preeminent cancer research organizations just identified glyphosate as a probable human carcinogen. So this was a hot public debate. And at the time, we saw the emergence of this group in the EU called Freedom to Farm. And it looked to everyday people like farmers around the EU saying, we absolutely need this chemical. Without it, we can't farm. It'll impact our productivity. Well, it turns out Freedom to Farm was an effort 100% funded by PR companies that had been paid for by the chemical company producing this weed killer, which was Bayer, and farther back was Monsanto. Bayer had bought Monsanto by that point. And so this effort, it ended up involving 4 different PR firms. They engaged in 7 different countries. They had a staff of almost 40 people, full-time people, working on this campaign. And it's just one example, but I think it's a powerful one because, again, to everyday people in the EU, even to many policymakers, they heard the voices of these people and they thought, wait a second, these are farmers. They're speaking to us. We care about farmers. We want them to be able to produce. But what they didn't know is these were not actually who they thought they were. It was actually a public relations campaign by industry. And I think that exposing that kind of misinformation and those stealth tactics is a really critical part of having policy making that actually reflects the public interest, including and especially the interest of farmers.
We have many organizations like that in India, which are funded by specific industries, and they call themselves farmers. They project themselves as farmers. They give out big advertisements for tobacco industry and things like that. But just two more questions. One is you have often stated that even if the world succeeds in capping fossil fuel emissions, if we fail to do so for the food system emissions, we are not going anywhere. We are still where we are. So what is the serious strategic thinking on this? And what about agroecology and social movements fitting into this strategy?
Yeah, well, that's another great question. And I started looking into the food and climate links many years ago when I wrote my last book, Diet for a Hot Planet. And what I've tracked since then is just an incredible body of research from around the world that really helps us understand now that the food systems, and so that's everything from what happens on the farm to processing to packaging to food waste, contributes 37% of all of the world's climate emissions. And that comes from carbon dioxide emissions, nitrous oxide emissions, methane, 37%. A significant piece of the troubling pie that is careening us on this course to really absolute planetary climate instability. And so experts are now telling us that if we only focus on electrification and we only focus on the energy sector, that we will actually blow through our carbon budget. And so the story that it's really important for people to understand is not that none of that other work is important. Of course, all of it is. But when we're talking about climate action, we need to put food on the table too. We need to be talking about food systems reforms. And the really good news about the story here, the good news about talking about food and climate, is that we know how to reduce food systems emissions. It's actually, I think, some of the easiest things we could do as societies. So it's things like we're currently wasting between 1/3 to half of all food we produce. If food waste were a country, if the emissions from food waste were a country, it would be the third largest emitter in the world. So imagine the benefits of reducing food waste, and not only to climate, but also to food access and to hunger. And we know the ways of producing food that don't have enormous impacts on the climate. And again, each of these things that we can do in food systems change has all of these wonderful co-benefits. So the same things we can do to reduce climate emissions on the farm, guess what? They're going to make farmers more resilient when there are droughts and when there are flooding events that we know will only get more extreme. So the good news is we can do something about this. We don't have to wait until there's some kind of new technology on the horizon to fix it. But it does take really social movements pushing on the industries that are driving us in the wrong direction and that have so much financial stake in continuing to drive us in that direction.
Your enthusiasm and your passion is infectious. So which gets me to the last question. How do you change public perception to force politicians and policymakers to make decisions that need to be made in light of all the industry and their money standing on one side? What is that quick fix or quick wins, or what will social media, will street activism help? Your last
Mm-hmm.
points on this point.
Yeah, well, I wish I had one quick fix. I mean, I think one of the things we all can do is raise our voices to make sure that whenever our policymakers or those in power are talking about climate, that they're also talking about food systems change. And that is one thing absolutely we can do, and we're really seeing that happen. I think the second thing that's really exciting to me is how much there is a broader public conversation about the role of government, certainly here in the US, the role of government in being on our side and on helping us fix the problem. There are so much money, so many resources that governments around the world have that could be marshaled toward this positive direction that currently are not moving in that direction. So there was a recent report from UNEP, UNDP, and UNFAO that estimated that hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayer money around the world are going to resource food systems practices that are actually heavily emitting, heavily polluting, not producing good, healthy food. That 87% of all of the world's public resources, public subsidies, and other resources are going kind of in the wrong direction. And that's on the order of magnitude of about $540 billion a year. So imagine if we were able to transition those resources to support farmers to, for instance, get off of dependency on petroleum-based chemicals, to support farmers to adopt practices, build healthy soil, help make them more resilient, that were subsidies that were going to really support the farmers producing really healthy food, not those that are producing the commodities that end up being the high fructose corn syrup and soda, or the feed that goes to livestock producers that then give us heavily processed meat that is so bad for our health. So there is, again, a good news story here, which is that there are hundreds of billions of dollars that could be marshaled for the kind of change we want to see. And it's up to us to really speak up to help our policymakers hear that that's the kind of change we want to see.
Thank you so much for your very pertinent and very pertinent words at this critical moment. Thank you so much. We'll be following your work as we have been following earlier. Thank you so much, and best of luck on your endeavor and your activism and your advocacy. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks for having me.